Welcome to the Dialectic by the Rajput and the Wasp. This is Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, with roots in India and education in the UK, and now an entrepreneur in the US.
And I am Glenn Carle, whom Atul insists on calling the Wasp and a Puritan and all that, which is all true.
Also a retired CIA officer, the former Deputy National Intelligence Officer in charge of transnational threats, and a senior partner at FOI. So if you have questions about geopolitical risks and opportunities and how to navigate your companies and organizations and even governments, you can come to the great sage, Glenn. And and FOI will answer some of your concerns
We are not
or
supposed
some
to
of your
lie.
queries.
We are not supposed to lie. Come on. Okay.
We are not lying. I mean, you are the equivalent of the great sage in modern times. Anyway, without further ado, we are going to talk about, can Germany and France make Europe great again? I repeat, can Germany and France make Europe great again? So, Glenn, that title presumes Europe was great. Was it great at some point?
Well, yes, it's no longer in vogue to acknowledge this except in a negative way. But for 500 years, Europe, or the West, as it's been called, has been the cock of the walk and has ruled literally much of the world and led the world in science, technology, culture, arts, by almost every metric. The vogue has shifted, and that is now viewed from a post-colonial, therefore a negative perspective, by a politically correct perspective. But yes, for 500 years that has been the case. In the course of history, one can argue that that has been an aberration, but it's defined the world for 500 years. Yes.
All right. Let's talk about, and I can say without any accusation of bias, that Europe was indeed great. There was a time India was great. There was a time China was great. There was a time, indeed, Persia or Iran was great. There was a time Egypt was great. There are various times in which different civilizations have an efflorescence, come up with great contributions, and for some reason they wither, if not die. And in the case of Europe, if we go to 1453, things seem bleak. Why? Constantinople has fallen, and it seems the Turks will roll over.
Atul, excuse me just for a moment. Let me jump in for our listeners. So I think what Atul will do now is just to give us a frame, a historical frame with which to look at the past 500 years and showing what explains Europe's ascendancy and domination. And then we'll get to why things have shifted and Europe is now struggling.
Brilliant. And we will not get lost in history. That's something we promise you. Some of our listeners have given us feedback, and we listen to your feedback very carefully. We are going to lay out the context, number one. Number two, we are going to go into current challenges. And number three, we'll try to look into our looking glass, or what is it called? The magic globe, or whatever it is.
Crystal ball.
Exactly, and try to conjure up scenarios for the future. So, context. 1453, everything seems iffy. The Turks have taken over Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire has finally collapsed after centuries of decay. And yet, at this very moment of crisis, you start seeing a resurgence in Europe. And we are being very reductive here. We will leave out many, many aspects of history because this is not a history podcast. The Rest is History is a podcast which we love, and that is brilliant on history. And we will provide you some historical podcasts too, as per popular demand. But quickly, Henry the Navigator appears precisely at the same time, perhaps because Europe needs a sea route now to India, and India features very prominently. After all, it is the search for India that leads to the discovery of America, and Native Americans are called Indians. So Henry the Navigator comes up with this extraordinary era, or rather inaugurates an extraordinary era of exploration. He starts sending ships east down the Portuguese and African coast, and bit by bit, you get to the Cape of Good Hope. Of course, Azores and um, other parts of the world are also discovered, and so there's an argument that later, especially with Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, that there is now the New World. So Henry the Navigator leads to the discovery of the New World. Remember, he's not necessarily a captain or an explorer, but he's the patron of these voyages of discovery. Then
If I
something,
could just jump in for a moment, Atul, this is
please,
called
please.
frequently from say 1450 on. You can argue about it. It's called the Age of Discovery, and what Atul is starting to run through is why was this the case, and he'll get into what and why in a moment. But when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople and changed the name to Istanbul, you'll know it as Istanbul. It completely closed off the Silk Route, any commerce really that Europe had, and Europe was a backwater of the world up until this point, with the rest of the world. Anything that happened had to go through the Ottomans, and so that was a chokehold, which they frequently used to choke Europe with. And so Europe thought, what can we do? Is there any way that we can literally bypass the block of the world? Now, the second point I'll make, and then I'll stop, is that you have to understand how the world was viewed by all civilizations at the time. China, the Persians, the Ottomans, and the Europeans. And that was the Chinese didn't care about the rest of the world. They were the greatest power on earth and the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom. But they didn't really know anything about Europe, and Europe knew essentially nothing about Asia. The intermediate power, the Ottomans and the Persians, knew about each, but only from the perspective of religious conflict, cultural conflict, conquest, and trade, and very little beyond that. It was not a single world. There was no one world. There were three different, broadly speaking, three different worlds of great civilizations. I wouldn't count Europe as a great civilization. It was, at that point, just a rising series of statelets.
Exactly. And so now we have a new world, the beginning of globalization in many ways, and it will lead to America, Europe, and China yoked together. And in this new world, eventually a third of the silver that comes out of the new world will find itself to China, lead to inflation, the collapse of the Ming dynasty, and indeed the ruin of Portugal and Spain thanks to inflation. But we'll do this period of history at another time in detail. In addition to the New World, you have a new Christianity, Martin Luther, 1517, the 95 Thesis on the church door of Wittenberg. And now suddenly Europe will have a conflagration that will only end in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War. So you
And
have a new
this is the key to the rise of Europe. Luther is both symptom and cause. And what was Luther? I actually, the religious issue to me is secondary, fundamental as it was and murderous as it proved. The issue was that orthodoxy, accepted truths, and power centers were challenged. This is the rise of the individual, and the rise of reason, which led to the scientific method, and that all occurred first and really exclusively in Europe, and that's the
Glenn,
driver of all these things.
if I can push back, right now it is it is the rise of individualism. The rise of reason will come later with the Enlightenment, because early Protestant faith can be pretty fanatical too and dogmatic. So Uh, But there is the focus on the individual, and the individual is in direct communion with God, and the individual is to interpret the Bible in his or her own way. So yes, it has the germ of the birth of reason, but as of yet, it is individualism that comes to the fore. So you certainly have a new Christianity. And then let's move on to something that happens in 1543, a year that most people do not pay attention to. And Glenn, do you have any idea what happens then in 1543?
1543.
Yeah.
I don't know this is a signal year in particular. I will be educated
Oh,
here.
my father basically, being a great surgeon that he is, banged it into me that this was the seminal year that changed everything. Because, of course, for him, what matters most is scientific discovery. Conquests occur, they come and go, religions come and go. But the most important thing in his worldview is indeed reason. And you've met my father, so you know he's a jolly good salt of the earth type of chap. And 1543, Nicholas Copernicus,
Oh, okay.
who is a Renaissance polymath, who formulates a model of the universe that places the sun rather than the earth at its center. This challenges the geocentric view of the
Yeah,
universe. And now,
absolutely one of the great moments in human history.
exactly, and now you have a new universe. No longer do human beings view the universe as they did. God does not stop the sun in the middle. Adam and Eve are not the center of the world. Suddenly there's a new universe which is vast, which is extraordinary, which is magical, and we are relatively insignificant, a small planet in a huge universe. And
And
that is
and that not only human existence and civilizations are not eternal or cyclical, but that history and human agency have come to be viewed in a linear, progressive way. That man can have agency, can affect his fate, and that one is not doomed to repeat endlessly a cycle of life. That central.
And 1543 is important, and this is where I show I'm my father's son, even though I am terrible at science and I'm not a doctor or a scientist or a surgeon. Andries van Wessel, better known as Andreas Vesalius, is an anatomist. He's a physician. He was born in Brussels, then part of Habsburg Netherlands. Most people forget the Habsburg Empire sprawled across Europe. And he publishes De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libri Septim, on the fabric of the human body, in 7 books. He's an anatomist and physician. And for the first time, he's dissecting corpses, he's dissecting bodies, and now you are discovering what lies under the skin. It is the birth of modern surgery and anatomy. You can see why my father cares so much about it. It is basically now the birth of the new body. You know muscles, you know tendons. You are not just imagining stuff. You are actually dissecting and observing. And so this is a major year. You're discovering not just a new universe, you're discovering the new body, both what lies beyond and what lies under the skin. And of course, how can we talk about the Renaissance without mentioning Leonardo da Vinci, the idea of the new man, the complete man, a true genius who was a scientist, an artist, all kinds of things. And of course, he was one of many. There was Michelangelo, there was Raphael, there were a whole galaxy of stars, and therefore Renaissance, which is rebirth, naissance, of course, meaning birth. You have the rebirth of a Europe that had been dormant through the Middle Ages, and we are going back to the glories of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Clearly, both Glenn and I have read our Edward Gibbon, and we do not lie on the Christian side of the historical interpretation. We take more of a pagan interpretation of history, and Europe is pulsating. Europe is dynamic. Europe is now, of course, thanks to its scientific revolution and its expertise in violence, going to colonize and subjugate the world. And that is brutal
So
indeed. But it's no more brutal than Genghis Khan. And Europe will be the cock of the walk for the next 5 centuries. Yes, sir. Shoot.
yeah, so if I may to summarize, not to steal your thunder, but try to echo it. What are these five, say, I forget the exact number, signal moments or developments? What do they represent? And as Atul pointed out to me, there's a new world view, a new universe, a new world meaning physically our world, the Earth, perceived in a new way. A new universe, Copernicus, a new body by Vesalius, a new way to look upon at man and to analyze who, what he is, how he fits into nature, and what may be done about it, if anything. A new Christianity, but there, the religion is actually secondary. To echo again Atul's point of just a moment ago, it's rather a way to look at man's place in the universe. Should man simply accept a fate and understand it? Integrate into it, or can perhaps man change it? And all of those new ways of looking at human existence, life on Earth, and practical matters too, critically, originated these changes in Europe. The world in which we live, from Beijing to Acapulco and everywhere between, in every conceptual way, is defined by and accepted as conforming to this way of understanding reality and human life. And it all comes from Europe. Now, I'm not quite yet a dead white man, so to be criticized and dismissed, but I realize that the conventional view would now be to attack that as neo-colonialist view and so on. That's all nonsense, frankly. This is simply the truth. These fundamental changes all originated in Europe and explain why, for 500 years, Europe has shaped the world.
Glenn, you're American. Your family has been here since 1620. I'm Indian. My family goes back over 1,000 years in India. And both of us are here discussing Europe because we are both, in our own ways, children of Europe. Intellectually, definitely, as well as politically, socially, and culturally as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I would argue China, the oldest civilization, profoundly. I mean, all of its glories are deserved. Uh, Nonetheless, China has become at least co-equal power in shaper of world affairs today because it has embraced the Reformation and the Renaissance, Age of Enlightenment views on human agency and how to affect the material and psychic world in which we live.
Brilliant. So now that we have established that Europe was indeed great, let's talk about the relative decline of Europe. And this happens post World War II in particular, although the seeds are there before. You could argue the seeds are always there. The seeds are there right since the religious wars, because on the one side, there is the Enlightenment, but on the other side, Europe has also had Inquisition. On the one side, you have this extraordinary stress on the this extraordinary emphasis on the individual, but on the other hand, you've had religious wars such as the 30 Years' War, which from 1618 to 1648 has seen much of Germany die.
One
So
third
you're
of the population of Germany was
indeed,
killed in the religious war.
yeah. Estimates vary from 25% to 40%. So 33 is the consensus number, but that is just ridiculous. That figure. Think of it. Take a step back. Just take a moment to let that sink. That is a crazy number. And Europe then gets the revolutions, 1848. Let's say 1789, and that leads to the birth of nationalism and wars, and then you get 1848, and then nationalism thunders on, and by 1914, the world of empires comes crashing down. The Russian Empire is gone. The Romanovs, who were in charge for 300 years, they are gone. The
If I could just,
Austro-Hungarian Empire.
if I may just jump in there, you said that the seeds of the explanation of greatness also contained the seeds of its self destruction. I would point to one thing if we want to just have a thumbnail uh, point to take away and summarize it all with, and that as the individual has become empowered through reason, and this is the triumph of the Age of Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and so on that we all have been talking about. We both have been talking about. That also undermines authority and cohesion, so that, and it justifies, not that a justification were needed, Indian or Nigerian or Chinese or anybody else under the thumb of the Europeans resentment because, well, if there isn't an preordained hierarchy of humans and civilizations, if all individuals have agency and should be recognized according to their own merits and desires, then nothing can justify that London rule Lagos or wherever else, and thus the empowerment of the individual and the justification, the centering of values around individual rights, led to nationalism, anti-colonialism, and the destruction of Western domination.
Excellent. So let's rifle through history, because both Glenn and I love history, and we don't want to drag you through various twists and turns of history. But suffice to say, the tragedy of World War One leads to so many young men dying in the UK, in France, in Germany, and particularly from the classes that led Europe. Um, the more educated, the better fed, the taller, or the ones with more opportunities. Yes, it's an unjust system, but now this tragedy leads to the collapse of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and indeed the Ottoman Empire. And the tensions never go away. And we see the rise of fascism and Nazism, and then World War II. And the suicide of World War II really is a blow from which Europe has arguably still not recovered. In fact, I would make the argument more definitively, it has still not recovered. And after World War II comes decolonization. That is a blow to European power, European prestige, and European self-confidence. I come from India, and India becomes independent on 15th August 1947. And that is because that is the second year anniversary of the surrender of the Japanese. And Lord Mountbatten considers that the best day of his life, and he decides India will be independent. But India becomes independent because the British have lost the ability to rule India and don't have the will, and India is now turning into a loss-making entity. Even as India decolonizes or India becomes free, and then all other colonies follow bit by bit, from Sri Lanka and Myanmar to Kenya eventually, and of course Malaysia, despite Mau Mau, despite the British SAS doing so well in the Malay insurgency, things are not hunky-dory. The Soviet shadow looms large. Winston Churchill gives a great speech about the Iron Curtain, and the East under USSR is ominous, and the West is in the shadow of the Berlin Wall. And forget decolonization, forget the Soviets. Let's talk about Western Europe itself. It is clear now that America is dominant. American dominance defines Europe. NATO keeps the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. So we have a continent, basically, which is not dominant, which is living under American protection, in fear of the Russians, losing its colonies, losing its power, prestige, and self-confidence. And it is, shall we say, not quite the best period for Europe. But arguably, it is in some ways the best period for Europe, because the citizens have never lived longer and never lived better. The birth of the modern welfare state occurs precisely during this time. And at the end of World War II, good old Winston Churchill, the codgy old warrior, is booted out, and in comes no nonsense, modest Clement Attlee and brings in the National Health Service.
Well, let's step back just for a second. Why? What are the broad brush description, I guess, of what happened? So England's the sun shone the brightest on the British Empire about the year 1848 or 1850, and it's been a slow relative decline. It was a slow relative decline for the succeeding 100 years, which embraced the period of the apex of the colonial period, but also its decline. At the end of World War II, uh, already by 1890, the United States was the largest economy in the world, but it wasn't exercising its power in any coherent or meaningful way yet. But by the end of World War II, the United States accounted, because of the destruction of this suicide, really, of World War II for Europe, the U.S. accounted for 50% of the global gross national product of global production. 50%, one nation which accounted for 5% of the world's population. And Europe was the French have a great word, exsangue, bled out. And production levels in Russia, Germany, France, the United Kingdom didn't return to pre-World War I levels, pre the period of the year of 1914, until the mid 1950s, during which time the United States had continued its ascent. So this is why just one metric to show that Europe had committed suicide and was at the lowest period of 500 years, really. The Renaissance, the Restoration, you could call it, I suppose, or return to health, was what occurred during the next three generations in my lifetime, which I interrupted you describing it.
Not at all. So we've come to we've described A, how Europe was great, B, how Europe went into relative decline, and now C, let's talk about restoration or attempts at restoration. And I think we have to remember that 4 April, as I mentioned, after World War II, NATO is created. That is very much under American leadership. But that very year, on 5 May 1949, the Council of Europe is established. On 9 May 1950, a year later, a plan for new political cooperation in Europe appears. And on 18 April 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community, the precursor, the predecessor of the EU, comes into being. This is based on the Schuman Plan. 6 countries sign a treaty to run their coal and steel industries under a common management. Now, note, coal and steel industries had led to these wars because ultimately France and Germany were battling for the coal and steel producing areas. And they gave you an edge in industrial production and in war. And these 6 countries are
Which is northeastern France, Belgium, and those are the areas of the most the most intense and lasting fighting in World War One for 4 years.
Indeed, and the 6 countries are Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Note, Belgium was the reason for war in 1914 because the Germans violated its sovereignty. The British jumped in, and
well, it goes. I know I'm going to sound obsessive here about history, but it illustrates your point. Belgium exists because of the tensions between Germany, France, and Great Britain, and it didn't exist. It didn't exist until 1815, and it was created as a buffer so that France would have a buffer from German imperial pretensions and overreach, and to control. And it was made neutral eternally, so that no one would dare to do anything to destabilize Europe and allow Germany once again to threaten everybody, or France. And thus,
in
that's where it
1815 it
was.
was France that excited terror. because of
Yes,
Napoleon.
yes, that's right.
Later, the roles switched, and after 1871, everyone was scared of Germany. So, anyway, we will not get lost in detail. Quickly, 19 March 1958, you get the birth of the European Parliament. So you're starting to see some kind of an attempt to bring Europe together, to put war behind, to focus on economic prosperity, and you you and you get a period of growth. Actually, the swinging 60s do occur. By 3 May 1960, the European Free Trade Association is created, and this is super important. This means that if you are a German, say, steel manufacturer or a sausage maker, it doesn't matter. You can sell your product to the furthest corner of Italy and France. And if you're a French winemaker, and if you are a French, say, luxury good maker, you can sell it in Stuttgart or Munich. So
Which had
this is
not been the
huge.
case before. That had not been the case.
Exactly. Exactly. Remember that even Germany didn't have a free trade area. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, and my German friends should not slit my throat. Zollverein, the customs union, was something that Bismarck brought in. And first, Bismarck made Germany a free trade union, because Germany was, of course, many states, each of them, charging tolls and tariffs.
But
And
that was not
our
until the mid 1860s.
Correct. And then, of course, France and Germany now become a free trade area. And this is happening at the same time as the Soviets building the Berlin Wall. They built the Berlin Wall in August
This is a really
1961.
this is a very important point. Why was Europe? There are two things. Everything is a contradiction of itself that explain Europe's struggle against the Ottomans for hundreds of years, and struggle today, and yet also it's the seeds of its greatness. And that is that Europe has always been a series of, in global terms, relatively small or minor states. And if it cannot cohere, united we stand, divided we fall. We all know that saying. And this is what has, since World War II, has been the great struggle to in Europe to underpin. Or enable Europe to become a global power again, which is to overcome these national divisions and the existence of competing states that undermine one another rather than work together. Thus, the Coal and Steel Agreement in 1949, was it, or 51? I forget. 49. And NATO, arguably NATO, European Commission, Common Market, European Union, and so on. Sorry.
You've hit the hammer on the nail. And so, and the important thing to note is that two things are happening in parallel. Europe, in some ways, is responding to the pressures of the Soviet Union. It is not a coincidence that when the European Free Trade Association is created on 3 May 1960, a year later, the Berlin Wall is built. One part of Europe is opening up, one part of Europe is building walls to keep its people in. And if we fast forward to 1968, and this is, the time when Czechoslovakia is a country, the Czech and the Slovaks haven't split. In 1968, a time Glenn knows well, and Glenn went to Czechoslovakia. You can listen to his stories of Czechoslovakia in a video on YouTube, Meet the Spy. But in 1968, on 1st July 1968, we have the beginnings of customs union. The six, by now EEC countries, remove customs duties on goods imported from each other, allowing free cross-border trade for the first time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a historic date. This is spectacularly important. This is almost as important as 1543, although my father will argue that is the key date in human history, or the key year in human history. Very exactly. Now, August 1968, is also important because the same year there's the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. And what do the Soviets do? They roll tanks as they did in 1956 and crush an uprising. So Europe is not just an economic idea by now. Europe is now a fundamentally powerful philosophical idea, political idea, and indeed, if I may so, now Europe is an ideal, and we will see momentum grow in the 1970s and even the UK in 1973. Denmark, Ireland, and the UK joined the EEC. And yes, of course, the oil crisis hits Europe, but Europe coheres, Europe survives, and Europe grows. And when the Soviet Union collapses, or rather, when I'm fast forwarding, Europe keeps expanding through the 80s. And in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. And I believe you were in Luxembourg that day and you picked up newspapers, if I remember
I was in
correctly.
Strasbourg.
You were in Strasbourg. Okay, you were in Strasbourg and you
Right.
picked up newspapers that day. In those days when we didn't look at screens, and of course you were surprised. And this is November 1989, and by 1991, Soviet Union is gone. 1991, the Yugoslavia doesn't exist. And 1992, you get the Maastricht Treaty. And this is when Europe expands. It lays out clear rules for a future single currency as well as for foreign and security policy. It also comes up with closer cooperation in justice and home affairs. In 1993, a single market with its four freedoms is established: the free movement of people, goods, services, and money. So now, basically, the European market is like the American market. Ladies and gentlemen, this is very important because now Europe as a market can punch at the same level as the US as a market. I'm not talking as a political entity. This is hugely important. And we get by 94, we have the European Economic Area, and the EU continues to expand. And it gains 3 new members in 95: Austria, Finland, and Sweden. And border-free travel begins in 7 countries. Then the Treaty of Amsterdam is born in 97. And on the 1st of January 1999, the euro is born. So we will not carry on with the history of the EU, but suffice to say, you see that Europe decided integration was the way forward. Europe decided that in an era of the Soviet Union and indeed of the USA, it had to unite. United, we stand; divided, we fall. And this post-war period is in some ways a great European comeback, because remember, cities in Germany were leveled, they were bombed out. So the German
Well, not
economic
just
miracle.
cities. The restoration or rejuvenation
Yeah,
and the return of Europe from World War II. To understand the destruction, one has to realize that in a population of, I believe it was 60 million Germans, 8 to 10 million of them had been killed in World War II. And that in the entire country, 1/3 of all buildings had been destroyed by the Russians or the Allies, the British, the Americans. So that's the level of absolute devastation that Europe had to recover from. Similar, one half, 50% of all French males between the ages of 18 and 35 had been killed in World War I. Atul touched upon the entire, almost literally, the entire ruling class of Great Britain was killed in World War I. It was a hecatomb means 1/10 are killed. It was far worse than a hecatomb. It was the destruction of a continent and its physical plant and human capital. It literally destroyed. That's what it returned from. So I would say, how do we summarize what Europe has done? They realized long before the destruction occurred that the globe was changing. Napoleon said, "When China wakes up, the world will tremble." He said that 225 years ago. The de Tocqueville wrote in 1830 that one could easily foresee that in future generations there would be two countries that would dominate the world, the United States and Russia. Uh, and how could Europe respond in these forecasts? Just were correct. How could Europe respond? It was by coming together, by cohering. What has been the result of what Atul has just run through? As he said, economically, Europe has become one of the global superpowers. I experienced this directly for many years in negotiations with Europe. Europe speaks with global power on economic affairs, along with now China and the United States. Those are the big three. It's changing now as India rises and all, but that still is the case.
No,
However,
no, Glenn, India is still relatively insignificant, and India lacks the
yes,
maturity and the expertise, and the state is still colonial. It's really just the big three as of
yes,
yet. It is the
that's
US,
true,
it is EU, and it is China.
right.
That those are the
However,
three entities.
politically, and this it's to this that will now turn really. Um, Europe,
Just let me stop you very quickly for a
okay.
second, and just say that post 1991, we won't go into all that happened because then it's a history podcast. The EU has experienced enlargement. There is a single market. There is a single currency called the euro. And there's a powerful European Commission that is very good at negotiating trade, very good at imposing competitive behavior as well. The European Commission, the competition commissioner, it has been more effective than the American one or even the Chinese one. So Europe as an economic entity is extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily dynamic. Yes, we'll get. There are problems, slowdown in growth for the last 20 years in particular. Yes, bureaucracy, yada yada. Yes, Brexit, but we'll get to that later. The key thing is relative to 1945, and that is the point we are driving in. Europe has greatly restored itself, partly thanks to the Marshall Plan, but also because of this integration. Without integration, you do not have the prosperity you see in Europe today. Over to you, Glenn.
Well, I think that gets us to, well, everything we're saying. It just sounds really great for Europe. So why are we talking about can Germany and France make Europe great again? What is the problem? And the problem, I think we would now turn to is political and the lack of not just unity but ability to coordinate and agree upon policies so that Europe can project any sort of, well, not any, global level of political power. And at an era of,
Let me remind our
yeah,
listeners. So, we've talked about how Europe was great. B, we've talked about Europe's relative decline. C, we've talked about Europe's restoration, at least to some degree, to prosperity, if not top dog status or dominance politically. And D, now we are talking about Europe's political cohesion, what the great 14th century political philosopher Ibn Khaldun called asabiya. Over to you, Glenn. Please carry on, educate us.
so well, so in the world that in which all of us live, our time, uh, what is the challenge then? And well, it's a different world than it was 30 years ago. It's a different world than it was 15 years ago. You do now have, for the first time in human history, China, that's not only the largest country in the world in terms of population, and perhaps the most dynamic economically and becoming so technologically and so on. You have a China that actually projects its power, that is a global actor. It has never been that way except for a brief period of a few decades, 600 years ago. Um, it's been content to have others come and pay homage to it as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, but it has never projected power. That's not the case now. China wants to have the world shaped in ways that suit its own inclinations, and that's a first. And you have the United States continuing, for all of its current struggles, to be, by virtually every metric, the global power. And then you have other nations rising, and the decline, such as India and Turkey and Brazil and so on. And you have the United States no longer willing and less able to be the first among equals and to set some sort of normative rules. In this world, an uncoordinated Europe, which cannot project power, even defend its own interests, except in a negotiation, is, if not helpless, is certainly going to be progressively at the mercy of others. As we were finding, you choose the index that you want to use for measurements, automobile industry or whatever, and so it is a struggle now to see whether Europe can cohere to restore its global position to some extent that it has enjoyed for these previous 500 years. And that's fundamentally a political challenge. Uh, but it's always been the dilemma there, because there are competing visions of. Oh, I forgot to mention an irredentist and a resurgent Russia, which is not as powerful by various measures as China or the United States, but has the second largest military and an aggressive leadership, and is irredentist, meaning that it wants to restore its greatness in at least Central Europe. And so those are the challenges that only a coherent Europe politically can perhaps meet. But this has been an eternal struggle between broadly speaking, two competing visions of Europe. One we'll call the French, and one we'll call the German models, or British model. Also, the British and Germans sort of agree on this. And for the French, the only way to come together is to come together and to have a single controlling entity. Frankly, politically, there will be a Europe that speaks with one voice. For the British and for the Germans, this is frightening, because that would mean the loss of national sovereignty and power. And by implication, the French mean that, well, when Europe speaks with one voice, it will speak in French, and the French will make the decisions. Um, and the Germans and the British and most others think, well, perhaps not. But this leads to paralysis, because the British model is a confederate Europe where people do things collectively. But when you have 32 member states, I think it is, in the European Union, or 37 states in Europe, whatever it is, 51 states, I forget the exact number, how can one actually coordinate any sort of policy when everything has to be done unanimously? And
Then
that's
I must
essentially
correct you.
impossible.
27 member states. Okay,
27 in the EU.
27 member states, not 37, not any other number.
27.
27. Glenn, let me. The time has come for us to dive deeper into the challenges Europe is facing. You've mentioned the broader. You've set out the broader geopolitical stage and the broader economic stage. There is an America under Donald Trump that scares Europeans. I was in Europe for uh, in many countries last year, if you remember, and again and again and again, there was great unease. And I speak to many European diplomats, and there is extraordinary unease amongst my European friends, whether here in Washington or when I speak to them uh, over over video calls or phone calls, and they are really worried about an America that is behaving in a bullying manner, that has asked the European states, and they have upped the figure to 5% of the GDP. At least they've claimed to do so on defense. They they are completely unnerved by tariffs. They were unnerved even by the Inflation Reduction Act under Joe Biden, to be fair. They complained bitterly about it. But the, the key point is the Europeans fear they cannot rely on America anymore. That's number one. This is internationally their number one concern. And It's not just politically, it's not just the defense security, it is economically, because guess what? The biggest market for the European companies is America. If you're a French luxury good maker, maybe China is a bigger market, but US is significant. But if you're any other European, you are indeed looking at Europe significantly, although, of course, German companies are yoked by the hip to China. But point is, the unreliability of the US and, frankly, the bullying nature of the US, especially J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, has shaken up the Europeans. Number two, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That has set the cat amongst the pigeons, and that has evoked two responses. The conventional response, and let me take Germany as a case study. The conventional response has been the SPD and the CDU and the CSU. These are SPD is the Social Democratic Party. It is the left-leaning center-left party. This Christian Democratic Union and the Christian Socialist Union are the center-right bloc that is in power right now. They believe that you have to diversify away from Russian energy sources. You have to invest in defense. You have to build back European capability to stand up to Russia. But right now, and this is where we get into the internal side of things, right now, what we are seeing is that over 20% of Germany is foreign born. In fact, 17.4 million, 20.9% of people living in Germany are foreign born. Immigration has changed the country. The AfD or AfD, if I, I don't speak German, so it is Allianz für Deutschland. It's polling at 27%, as per some opinion polls, while the CDU-CSU bloc is only at 24%, and it's on the rise. And some of them believe that, let's just get cheap energy from Russia. Let's have a modern version of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I'm being facetious. Please don't get offended, those of you listening to us. I'm not suggesting that the Germans are going to roll tanks into Poland. Far from it. But what they say is that let's get cheap energy from Russia. Let us focus on having industrial competitiveness. Let us chart our own course. And let us focus on Germany becoming an economic power, and if need be, even leaving the EU. So what is happening even within Germany is a lack of cohesion, because the AfD cares about something else. And indeed, a lot of the Turkish population of Germany, 67% roughly, or 66%, if I remember correctly. We did this analysis in an earlier video called FOI of our series FOI Exclusive. Vote for Erdogan. They're Islamists. They care about Gaza. They do not care about Ukraine. So the cohesion within Germany is gone. The cohesion within France is gone. The French prime minister, yet another prime minister, has resigned. And this
He
has
lasted
become a bit of
24 hours, the shortest prime ministership
no. He
in modern
lasted
French
less than
history.
a month, not 24 hours.
Well,
That's
well,
like a
well, you could. It depends on definitions here. You could say 21 days from the time he was appointed or nominated, but it
26
was
days in the role.
26. But it was less than 24 hours from the time he formed a government and actually attempted to
Yeah,
rule. But
exactly.
I'd like Atul. I'd like
But
to
well, hold
take a.
fire, just very quickly. This is the third French prime minister since December 2024. That's the only
Okay.
fact I want the listeners to remember, is that France cannot even form a government, leave aside a budget. So cohesion in France doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Marine Le Pen is on the rise. The far right has a different view when it comes to Ukraine and Gaza and immigration. There are a lot of immigrants in France itself. So cohesion within countries is gone. And let's not even talk about cohesion within Europe. Hungary
Well,
pulls in one direction, Slovakia in
hold on.
another, and the UK has quit thanks to Brexit 2016. Over to you, Glenn.
Yeah, the issue of social cohesion is an important one, and I don't know that we differ so much as we have different perspectives or weigh that issue differently. But I'd like to put that on hold just for a moment and take a step back and maybe up, if I can, if I can conceptually describe things that way. So we've described the challenge of the changed world or changing world for Europe and the destruction that Europe has recovered from, and yet the constraints being political cohesion, to use the word that Atul strengthens on. So what can Europe do? And I'd say I'll discuss this cohesion issue in a moment, but there are, broadly speaking, two approaches, as we started to discuss. We'll call it the French model and the German model. The French say, well, okay, we speak with pretty much one voice economically, or all Europeans say this, and it's true, but we need to do this politically. And their framework, the French approach for decades has been of strategic autonomy from the United States, no longer to be under the American umbrella, but to be able to act independently and have the means to do so. If you don't have the means, it's all talk. So they propose, the French, essentially a federal Europe of sovereign states with an independent military force as well as industry, and thus an independent foreign policy. And to do that, we Europeans must come together politically with a single, coherent structure of government, really. That's the French proposal. They've always pushed for that. They've never succeeded. The counter to that is the German-British model, which is essentially a confederate Europe, but in a unified political body, nonetheless, a Europe that is democratically decides its policies, and that those would be largely reinforcing the agency, the independence, and the strength of individual states. The consequence of this has been, as Atul touched upon, the rise of all sorts of factions, I'll call them, to use an 18th century American term, that paralyze each nation state. We see this in France, we see this in Germany, see this progressively in Holland and in Great Britain and so on. It's led to or enabled economic dynamism, relatively, but politically it has been paralyzing. But the Germans and the British, and not only them, the Dutch too, argue, but the surrender of sovereignty to some supra-state out of Brussels, possibly controlled by others, if not the French, is unacceptable, because that means a loss of our sovereignty and our independence. And unless Europe can resolve which of these two models will be the future of Europe, then Europe cannot respond to the challenges it faces. I would argue that the French are correct, that unless there is a single entity that can coordinate and carry out policy, Europe politically, in a sense, is a midget. However, that's not acceptable to hundreds of millions of Europeans. And that is the dilemma. Now, before we move on to whether this issue can be resolved or how to do it, just a word on the social cohesion issue. And here I think Atul and I have slightly different perspectives. He's powerfully described the paralysis and the tensions and the dangers that come from all of these reactions to these pressures within societies and the changed nature demographically of European societies because of immigration from peoples of different civilizations, not just, they don't share the heritage or the languages or the cultural perspectives in many ways. And Atul implies, if not argues, and I'm not speaking in any way to dismissively, that is an obstacle, a profound obstacle, and perhaps something that will stop the possibility even of coming together, of cohering and acting in a unified way. I differ on that point, at least potentially, that so long as there is an acceptance of a couple of fundamental precepts, and I think this is Atul's point, and I agree with it. If there is an agreement on certain precepts, which I'll mention, then diversity is not a destroyer necessarily, and it can be overcome. But if those differences are do remain, then it is hard to have a coherent society, and they are. I think can be illustrated. I think I can illustrate them by a an exchange that some French people had in recent years concerning uh, Islamic immigration to France. And a Frenchman asked his French Islamic uh, counterparts in the conversation, I only have one question. Do you accept the supremacy of the state, of the government, and the fundamental rights, essentially the Declaration of Human Rights? If you do, then I don't care what you do, how you dress, where you go, what you think at all. Those are the only fundamentals that are required. The response in this exchange by the Islamic Frenchman was to become instantaneously angry and to say that the Frenchman was attacking his religion and was acting in a colonial way, and rejected that. If that issue is not resolved, if the Islamic person doesn't accept the supremacy of the state, which means the subordination of certain views and actions by anyone of any belief, then the society cannot cohere. I would argue over generations that all religions and immigrants do what's the word? You used to say melting pot. They do assimilate, but that's a prospect of 75 or 100 years. If that happens, then Europe can cohere. But those are the challenges uh, facing Europe and the two models that are struggling and have always
So,
struggled.
so Glenn, very quickly, my observations on your description on the two models are they're both rooted in the history of the two nations. France chose a centralized model as early as Louis XIV, Louis XIV, and so uh, Jacques Delors, the man who constructed modern Europe, wanted a single currency. He was a devout Catholic. He envisaged a dirigiste state. And the German,
Dirigiste, which means centralizing control and the state uh, directing economic, political, and social activity from a central point.
thank you, Glenn, thank you for that pithy and accurate and very enlightening definition. So dirigism is in stark contrast to a more free market approach that Adam Smith championed in the UK and that Protestant countries favor. The Protestant work ethic by Max Weber is still alive. It is not yet dead. You can see the difference between Protestant countries like Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Germany, and the Catholic bloc like Spain, France, Italy, etc. Yes, of course, there are places like Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg that are Catholic, but culturally they've become more Protestant. Now, the point I'm making is that the Germans were always, apart for the aberration that happened under Nazism, were always a nation of regions. Even today, you look at train lines in Germany. You can go from Stuttgart to Bavaria to Munich fairly easily. You can go. There are rail lines from say Hamburg to Frankfurt, and Hamburg is a port city, and Frankfurt is the financial city, and Munich is the city of BMW and industry, and Stuttgart is the city of Mercedes, and Munich also has some startups. Berlin has design now, but Germany is a nation of many cities. France is dominated by Paris. France does not have so many economic centers of activity as Germany. So both these countries' models are defined by their respective histories, and therein lies the dilemma of France wanting more dirigism at the EU level, whilst Germany wanting more of a confederation, because Germany is more of a federal society. And the rise of the AFD, Glenn, you pointed out when we were preparing for the podcast, is the classic dilemma, the eternal appeal of Ostpolitik, Eastern politics, because Germany is the heart of Europe. And it is the dilemma of pursuing Middle Europe. And Germans and Central Europeans, as you said, always must look both west and east. They cannot ignore the east. And we have to remember that the meeting of generals in Washington, D.C. recently has spooked the Germans more than anyone else. They remember a time in the 30s when generals were summoned by a corporal but who wasn't terribly tall and wasn't particularly blonde. The joke in Nazi Germany was that a true Nazi is as fit as Goering, as handsome as Goebbels, and as fair as Hitler. And so the sight of Donald Trump lecturing, or his sidekick lecturing generals on fitness and manliness, was a bit disorienting. And the point I'm making is that Europeans are spooked by Donald Trump making a deal with Vladimir Putin. In particular, Germany is spooked by this. And they think this would leave German economic and security interests in tatters. So Germany has a slightly different view than France. But the pressures to come together exist, but at the same time, just as there are centripetal forces, there are centrifugal forces. And it remains to be seen what plays out. The loss of the UK to the EU, Brexit in 2016, has hurt Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, enormously. But many of my friends who are Europeans have confided privately that it has hurt the Europeans, particularly in trade negotiations, particularly in diplomatic engagements, because the British diplomacy and indeed the French diplomacy has the most experience, thanks to their history of empire, of negotiating with different parts of the world.
Well,
They,
I wouldn't glorify England so much, but I would come to the same conclusion about the consequences or the effects of Brexit on Europe, on Great Britain, and on world affairs. It's simply Europe. No. Great Britain is one of the four great powers, four major powers of Europe, and without it, Europe has less potential and less ability to speak with one and with a strong voice. It's as simple as that. I wouldn't necessarily grant the British superior
maybe
qualities over a German diplomat or a Danish one. It's a matter of
maybe I
economic
was colonized. I
GNP.
was colonized at Oxford, Glenn. That is the answer.
That's right. Anglophile as I am, to no one, no man is a hero to his valet, and so the English are like everybody else, but they're significant, and they've
No, they've
removed
declined.
themselves
You're right.
off into the Atlantic.
No, they've declined dramatically, and people want to go to Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and not the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office anymore. So that's true. I accept that. Let's get to the final section of our podcast. Okay, we've talked about A, Europe was great. B, the relative decline post World War II. C, the restoration or attempts at restoration. D, cohesion, and E, can Europe actually become great again? Can the French and the Germans come together, given their different histories, given their different conceptions, given their different worldviews, to come up with an idea of Europe, work together, and also, most importantly, perhaps, given their internal disintegration? France cannot even have a prime minister, and Germany has AFD on the rise, and a religious Islamic minority that cares more about Gaza than Ukraine. So, can these societies cohere? And over to you, Glenn, because you take the more optimistic point of view. You
Right.
think crisis, and perhaps only from crisis comes opportunity. So, please explain.
Yeah, so we're at the crystal ball section here, where no one has any powers of prediction almost, but I think we do. I think we do differ. Perhaps not, but no matter. I would. My sense is that the answer to can Europe cohere, can Europe come together politically and become a great power equal to its economic strength and a peer of the United States and China, the answer would be no. They've never been able to overcome the differences we spelled out between this federal model and confederal model, between a centralized political unit and a Europe of sovereign states and peoples. So why would it change? And the the answer would be no, unless catastrophic threat and crisis uh, could make possible a change. And I think we have examples of how this is the case. And some of you, many of you will have heard of, some of you will have read Thomas Piketty's book on capital. It's one of the seminal books I have ever read. And we can broaden the explanations from the world of economic issues to political ones too. The point being that at no time in human history have societies succeeded, whether it's the Romans or the Ottomans or the French under Louis XIV and since, or the Americans or the British, anyone, no society, no country has ever succeeded in arresting the concentration of wealth and the concentration of political power, except during moments of nearly existential catastrophe. And only in those periods has there been radical reformulation and constitution of societies and distribution of economic power and political power. So, similarly for Europe today, if the threat from a resurgent Russia, an ascendant, globally acting um, China, and a continuing great power, America, if those threats so undermine the ability of Europe to act or to stay together or to survive in a certain sense, then it may be possible for the leaders, uh, struggling as they are in France or Germany or Great Britain and so on, to make fundamental changes in political organization that would allow Europe to cohere. If these existential crises are not perceived as existential or acted upon, then Europe will continue to be a political dwarf and an economic but declining economic power. It's not in any way certain that Europe can meet the moment of destruction. I mean, it's quite possible that in this cauldron, Europe will melt and fail. It is conceivable that Europe will be able to mold a new structure from the searing pressures that it's facing, but only will it be able to do so in response to an existential crisis? And arguably, Europe is facing existential crises now. That's my response.
Very quickly, let me give color to the big crises, so the big strains Europe faces. Of course, everyone knows demography and debt. Europe is an aging continent, and debt is high. You can see concerns over French debt rising, bond yields growing, and the lack of ability to even have a prime minister is adding to the French woes. Um, how does an aging, indebted continent make a valiant leap forward? We don't know, has never been done before. Who will bail out Southern Europe? And that may include France, of course, Italy, which is also aging. Um, we don't know. Um, we talked about internal cohesion. I talked about AFD having 27% of support in polls. And Glenn talked about a very important issue that um, the Frenchman views the state as above everything. Religion, which was once, to quote Eric Hobsbawm, a great historian, Marxist, and even though neither Glenn nor I like Marxism, I think very highly of Eric Hobsbawm, and
I
Hobsbawm
admire
talked about
Hobson.
yeah, and Eric Hobsbawm talked about religion being like the sky covering everything in the life of Europe, to then receding to become a cloud. And in France, the tradition of laicite, and Glenn has lived in France, speaks French like a Frenchman, um, knows the country inside out. Laicite is French secularism. In France, the state after 1789, and especially after the Third Republic, is paramount. You have freedom of religion, but it is the state that transcends religion, and that is the case in all of Europe, and that, you could argue, is the Westphalian model since 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. In Islam, you do not have this conceptual framework. In Islam, it is all Muslims, if they are particularly devout, are part of Ummah, universal brotherhood. In that sense, Islam is like communism. The ideal is a universal community. Under communism, it was the Soviets coming together and forming a universal society, and Islam is Muslims forming a universal society. And if you're religious, your first allegiance, if you're particularly religious, your first allegiance is not to the state, and therein lies the fundamental clash of civilizations that Samuel P. Huntington talked about. He talked about more in terms of competition between states, but I think the competition is more within the states, and in particular for the minds and hearts of the Muslim minorities. And just as Glenn told a story, I'll tell you a story. I have a friend, a European friend, who married someone from Asia. And we will not go into the nationalities, we'll not go into which country in Europe and which country in Asia, that is irrelevant. And she has children, and she has uh, pretty daughters, and she said that she's increasingly uncomfortable with the ghettos in Europe, with the dress codes that seem to operate in these ghettos, and in particular with the fact that if she says anything that is critical of Islam, she's accused of being Islamophobic. She says that she's not a believer, she's not Christian, and she mocks the idea of both Lutheranism and Catholicism, and that is fine. But the moment she says anything against Islam, she's Islamophobic. And she said that, look, that sort of censorious attitude on the part of the authorities, in particular the center left, is going to drive people to the far right, because you simply cannot have this dichotomy. You cannot have people fearing that their lives will be taken because you say something against Islam. And she pointed out to Salman Rushdie being attacked and a fatwa on his life. And you cannot have this censorious attitude that if you say anything against radical Islam, you are fundamentally intolerant. And my one of my friends who's ex-MI6 pointed out to me that, look, he said, there will be a reckoning within Europe, because at some point you cannot have people congregating around the mosque, enjoying all the fruits of the welfare state, European, and living in the European model, and yet harboring resentment, whether it is because of uh, uh, perceived or indeed real wrongs done to their forefathers. And at some point, you may very well see some people leaving Europe or being kicked out. And this has been done before. The Huguenots, who were far more productive and far more dynamic, and indeed took watchmaking to Switzerland, were kicked out of Catholic France. And he said
The
that Europe
Huguenots were
has.
French Protestants.
Yes, exactly. I lived in the Huguenot Quarter in London at one point. Anyway, and that's now just, if you go further, it's now occupied by Bangladeshis. So times change. It was earlier occupied by Jewish people. So in an ideal world, over time, this minority becomes secularized, follows football. The French football team is a model of integration and is the future. In another world, um, Some of these are disaffected, they riot, the banlieues are set on fire, some of them join radical organizations like the Islamic State. And both of those are valid scenarios. And I personally feel that that reckoning is not yet there, and internal cohesion rather than external pressure is Europe's biggest problem. And it'll be hard to overcome it. Eventually, in the long run, it'll probably be surmountable. But an aging continent with an unassimilated minority is and high degrees of debt is a major problem. And Europe will at the same time have to invest in becoming more dynamic because bureaucracy is killing Europe. Lack of productivity growth is not great for Europe. The German car industry was snapping at the wheel, and the Chinese have come in no time to eat their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Um, and Europe will have to make these fundamental economic shifts. It has to be more nimble, it has to be more cohesive, and it has to just adapt to the modern world. Has it done it before? Yes. Can it do it? Yes. But I foresee a lot of friction and a lot of unrest, and dare I say, 1848 like eruptions before Europe gets there. Over to you, Glenn, for the final word.
For the final thing. So I think we both say it is Europe. Can Europe cohere? The answer is yes, if with significant doubts as to whether the ifs can be addressed affirmatively. Would you agree with that's a synopsis of our view?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean,
Yeah.
we already talked in our preparation that blueprint or blueprints exist. Mario Draghi's plan, which
Right.
is the Draghi report for European competitiveness, September 2024. It focuses on investment, decision making, increasing competition. It's a very
Good.
good report. Similarly,
So yes.
similarly, Europe still has extremely good universities. Europe still has the ability to make things to a
So
high degree of quality. Just
right.
let me finish. And America's chasing away of talent. I was yesterday I was at the Swedish embassy at their university fair, and there were, I think, 8 or 10 Swedish universities wooing American talent and indeed international talent to come and do masters and PhD there. And so America's self goal when it comes to cutting off of scientific funding, restricting visas for talented um, uh, scientists and students may well be a great opportunity for Europe. And yes, Europe has the sins of no internal cohesion, no central executive power with agency, overregulation, and of course, lest we forget, we should talk about talking about overregulation, the farce of the standard European or standard essential patent, which also applied to the standard European penis, which our friend Colin McKernan, one of the great IP lawyers, a great Irishman with a phenomenal sense of humor, put in his IP glossary. And do you want to read out from the IP glossary, Glenn?
No. I'll just for our listeners who otherwise will be completely bemused about how this came up. Um, I'll summarize that Atul is alluding to, as an example of the overregulation by Brussels, by Europe, which has led to the resistance to a coherent centralized Europe. The fact that the bureaucrats in Brussels were defining what the ideal size of a male, well, obviously male, of a penis would be in Europe, and others have maybe suggested that, well, we don't really need Brussels to define that for everyone in Europe or everywhere else. So, which
And by the
is
way,
a good example.
it turns out they defined it a bit too large, and the Italians were the only ones who initially objected to it. But then, of
Showing great
course,
courage, showing great
showing
courage
great courage, but then
to
immediately withdrew because of the popular uproar that suggested that Italians were lesser than their German
all
and
right.
other European counterparts.
I will bring this from the absurd, albeit real, to a final point. And I think it's an optimistic lesson that one can take from American history, I think.
Hmm.
Over and over, um, leaders and people from states that are have been less diverse sociologically or ethnically, religiously, and by every other measure, and less um, confederal or decentralized or federal, have looked at America and thought, my God, this is a mongrel nation that can't speak with one voice. And so we really, clearly we will be able to dominate them. And the Nazis thought this, the British thought that about the colonial Americans in the 1770s, and on go the examples. I've heard it an infinite number of times from non-Americans in conversations around the world during my lifetime, that this is sort of a reflexive assessment of the incoherency, the inability to come together, speak with one voice, have any standards of a democratic, pluralistic society of a federal state. And invariably, that has been wrong and condescending. Uh, so, because the powers of individuals who can coordinate rather than receive instruction from on high have proven superior economically and politically, and then in projections of power. So, if that is true, if not universally true, it's certainly been proven possible many times by the United States in its history, then Europe too uh, can, through its historic, its essential pluralism of societies and states, rise to the occasion in a way that could be successful and powerful. Not guaranteed, but the cacophony need not be endless discord, but could lead to future and transcendent harmony, to be poetic about it. So there is
Exactly.
some possibility.
Yeah. And to ground it a little bit, what Glenn is alluding to is yes, there are challenges. Yes, indeed, we have referred to many of them. Yes, Brexit has shaken Europe, and yes, indeed, there was democratic deficit in the EU, which led to Brexit. And yes, so many languages, so many different members, so many competing priorities, so many different histories. After all, the history of Poland is very different to the history of Portugal. Uh, One suffered under communist rule until recently, and the other suffered under Salazar. And of course, it was the EU that helped Portugal and Spain modernize. Remember, these are democracies more recent than India's. And when we look at the long arc of history, the longue durée, as the French like to call it, of time, uh, post 1945 Europe is a phenomenal achievement. You have a welfare state, you have healthcare, which is a lot cheaper than America. You have more leisure than any other part of the world. You have a high quality of living. And yes, some of that might have led to perhaps indolence that is normal. Some of that might have led to overindulgence in deficits and debts. And some of that will eventually have to lead to painful decisions about raising taxes, cutting expenditures, changing the nature of the state, and also coming up with a model for Europe. How will Europe come up with its own political structure? The US, of course, was very decentralized, a number of colonies. What does democracy look like? Uh, and two questions which my friend Olivier Lavinal, a man who played rugby like Glenn Carle for Sciences Po, said Europe will have to figure out two important questions, or any political entity really has to figure out two important questions. What is the unit of power? And in that unit of power, what is the heart of power? And I would add a third. How will Europe hold that power accountable? And we believe that in balance, there are many scenarios. There are centrifugal forces, there are centripetal forces, but it can be done. Perhaps it will be done. There may be some pain along the way. There may be some tears people shed. But on the whole, Europe is a unique experiment in the history of humanity. It is a bunch of nation states coming together to create a supranational entity out of will, not through conquest, not in the Napoleon Bonaparte model, not in the Genghis Khan model. And out of this unique experiment, something quite wonderful could still emerge.
And I would just conclude by a biblical, religious allusion, which I think is, I'm not being facetious, which is illustrative. Many of us will reflexively think and refer to the Tower of Babel, the incoherence among the languages and the discord, and that is meant to evoke. And there's truth to that. But what is that perspective from? That's the perspective of an outsider from a less sophisticated society who was describing the Tower of Babel. And one must remember that the fundamental reality was that the greatest civilization and state, the most dynamic one of that time, was Babylon itself, because of its diversity and the clash of all of its tensions and differences. So we shouldn't assume that the perspective of the outsider from the more provincial perspective is the one who's describing reality and the future most accurately.
How opposite that a descendant of Puritans should end with a biblical story. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you again very soon. We have a series of podcasts planned. The next 2 ones will be on Germany and France, and then we'll dive into history. Keep listening to The Dialectic. Make sure you follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, or indeed our website if you're listening to us there. Sign up for Fair Observer's newsletter. And if you have geopolitical questions, come to the great sage, senior partner, FOI Glenn Carle. On that merry note, ladies and gentlemen, au revoir. Auf Wiedersehen.
Later.